It was 6:19 a.m., the kind of quiet that feels staged, like the world is holding its breath before something breaks. The Caribbean Sea lay flat and glassy, dawn stretching thin gold lines across the water, when two dark specks cut the horizon. Fast, low, closing. Not birds, not civilian traffic. Knives of metal sliding through morning light. On the deck of the carrier, sailors froze mid-step as engine noise crept in. Faint at first, then unmistakable. This wasn't routine. This was intent. The jets came in hard. Venezuelan K. 8 attack aircraft, barely 2,000 feet above the water, ripping through the comm like a shockwave. No radio call. No identification. Just speed and proximity. They crossed the bow of the strike group, so close the air itself seemed to flinch. It looked reckless. It felt personal. A message written not in words, but in altitude and velocity. This is how modern confrontation begins, not with missiles, but with nerves. On the bridge, no one shouted. No alarm screamed. Binoculars tracked the jets as they banked sharply, afterburners flaring, heat distortion bending the sunrise. The carrier did not turn. It did not slow. 90,000 tons of steel and nuclear power stayed locked on course, slicing north through open water as if nothing had happened. Because reaction is what intimidation feeds on. Below deck, screens told a colder story. Radar painted every angle. Infrared showed empty hardpoints. No weapons. This was an attack run. It was theater, a calculated dare. Fly close enough to provoke fear. Pull away before crossing the line. Measure what happens next. Here's the risk with dares at sea. You don't need a missile to start a war. You need one mistake. One misjudged turn. One pilot too proud to blink. The jets peeled off toward the Venezuelan coast. For a heartbeat, it seemed over. The sea exhaled. Sailors relaxed their shoulders. Then the radar picture changed. 2 contact became 4. New vectors. High speed. Climbing. Closing again. This wasn't coincidence. This was choreography. In the Combat Information Center, voices stayed flat, almost bored, as if reading weather data. That calm wasn't ignorance. It was algorithmic discipline. Every scenario rehearsed. Every second mapped. When the order came to prepare interceptors, it wasn't emotional. It was mechanical. Precision over panic. Above deck, Super Hornets rolled forward. Catapult snapped. Metal screamed into sky. In seconds, American fighters were climbing through layered sunlight. Engines howling. Sensors drinking in data. Their job wasn't dominance. It was control. Identify. Shadow. De-escalate if possible. Look at the asymmetry. 2 low-cost trainers versus a carrier strike group worth tens of billions. This wasn't about firepower. It was about perception. About who owns the sky in front of the cameras. About forcing a reaction that could be spun later into victory. The Venezuelan jets came back in tighter formation now. Closer. Bolder. They crossed flight paths. Cut noses. Triggered proximity alerts. Each pass shaved seconds off the margin between posturing and catastrophe. 10 seconds. 8. 6. What would you do with 6 seconds left? Still, the carrier did not move. To an untrained eye, that looks like arrogance. To naval doctrine, it's the core mechanism of deterrence. You don't flinch because flinching teaches the world how to push you. Movement is concession. Stillness is dominance. This is the paradox of power at sea. The most aggressive act is often doing nothing at all. The jets roared low enough to cast shadows across the waves. Close enough for pilots to see faces through canopies. Close enough for one bad input to rupture the morning into global headlines. Yet the response stayed measured. Cameras rolled. Sensors logged. Every maneuver was captured, time-stamped, archived. Because in modern conflict, data outlives adrenaline. What looked like chaos from afar was, up close, a controlled experiment. A stress test. How far could they go before the line snapped? How disciplined was the machine behind the silence? And then, just as suddenly as it began, the jets turned away again, engines fading, the sea smoothing itself back into calm. No shots fired, no warning screamed, just the echo of what almost happened. But make no mistake, this wasn't over. Because intimidation isn't about the moment itself. It's about what follows. About who tells the story. About who blinks on camera and who doesn't. Somewhere, footage was already being edited. Claims already drafted. Victory already declared. And somewhere else, analysts were rewinding frames, counting meters, measuring intent. The jets had tested the surface. What they hadn't yet tested was the depth underneath. And the next move would not be as theatrical. At 6:24, the radar stopped telling a simple story and started warning of intent. 2 contacts had become 4. Speed increasing, altitude climbing, vectors tightening like a closing fist. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. This was a second move, and in conflict, the second move is where truth shows itself. Below the flight deck, the carrier's command spaces stayed dim and deliberate. No raised voices, no dramatic pauses, just data flowing across screens in cold, unforgiving clarity, range, bearing, rate of closure, every variable feeding an algorithm built for moments exactly like this. The sea above remained calm, but inside the system, tension climbed by the second. The Venezuelan jets returned sharper this time, their passes tighter, their angles riskier, cutting airspace like scalpels, not a strike, but to provoke a reaction, because reaction is currency. If you force your opponent to move, you've already won half the battle. But the carrier did not move. 90,000 tons of steel held speed, held heading, held doctrine. That decision mattered more than any weapon on board. Then the order came, quiet, precise, irreversible. Launch the Hornets. On deck, choreography replaced chaos. Yellow shirt signaled. Engine spooled. Metal strained against restraint. The catapult officer dropped his hand. And in a heartbeat, 2 Super Hornets were ripped forward, hurled into open sky by electromagnetic force. No roar of bravado. Just raw physics doing what it was designed to do. 6 seconds. From 0 to airborne. 6 seconds to change the equation. The Hornets climbed fast, sunlight catching their wings as they banked toward the intruders. Sensors came alive. Radar locked. Data links fused every eye in the sky into one shared picture. The pilots weren't hunting. They were measuring. Intercept. Identify. Shadow. Control without contact. This was restraint at Mach speed. The Venezuelan formation reacted immediately. Turns sharpened. Altitudes shifted. One jet crossed too close, triggering proximity alerts. A deliberate brush with disaster. 10 meters closer, and metal would meet metal. No missiles, no guns, just risk weaponized as pressure. The Hornets didn't bite. They slid into position like chess pieces, not predators. Offset, above and behind. Always visible, always recording. Every move logged, every deviation time-stamped. This wasn't a dogfight. It was surveillance dominance. Below them, the carrier strike group tightened its geometry. Destroyers adjusted their screen, closing ranks without altering course. Electronic warfare systems hummed quietly, nudging the electromagnetic spectrum just enough to blur targeting solutions. Not a blackout, a whisper, precision over noise. Here's a comparison no one sees in the headlines. A few $1 million worth of jets try and bend the will of a floating city that costs more than some nations' GDPs. Firepower versus foresight, mass versus mind. And yet the most powerful thing in that moment wasn't the hardware. It was discipline. The Venezuelan pilots kept pushing. Another pass. Lower. Faster. Angles collapsing. This was a danger zone. The thin air where pride overrides calculation. Where a single misread can rupture everything. The Hornet pilots felt it. The deck crews felt it. The bridge felt it. What would you do if you knew the next 10 seconds could rewrite history? The carrier still didn't turn. That choice was a turning point. Because once escalation fails to provoke movement, the psychological balance shifts. The message becomes unmistakable. We see you. We track you. We are not impressed. The Venezuelan jets began to hesitate. Spacing widened. Speed dipped. The choreography lost its edge. When intimidation stops producing fear, it becomes exposure. Every risky maneuver now looked less like strength and more like recklessness, captured in high definition, stored forever. This is a paradox of dominance. You don't prove it by striking. You prove it by making strikes unnecessary. Eventually, the formation angled away. Not all at once. One jet lingered, circling wider than needed, as if searching for a final reaction. It didn't get one. The Hornets maintained shadow, neither chasing nor retreating. A moving boundary, a silent warning. As the jets pulled back toward the horizon, the sea returned to its mirror calm. Engines faded. Sensors stayed awake. Nothing was over, but something had been decided, because in that exchange, one side tried to manufacture a moment. The other refused to give it meaning. Strategy had beaten spectacle. And somewhere beyond the curvature of the Earth, someone was already preparing the next move, one that wouldn't rely on flybys or bravado, but something quieter, harder to detect, because when intimidation fails in the air, pressure doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. At 6:31, the margin for error collapsed to seconds, and the skies stopped forgiving mistakes. The jets didn't just pass anymore, they carved. They sliced across flight paths with intent sharp enough to feel through glass and steel. Near miss after near miss. Altitude dropped. Speed surged. The airspace tightened until there was no room left for bravado to hide behind. This was the danger phase, the part nobody sees coming. A Venezuelan jet rolled hard, inverted, then dove, fast, aggressive, reckless, toward the heart of the formation. It wasn't an attack. It was worse, a test of nerve, a dare that asked one question: who breaks first when 10 seconds decide everything? On the carrier, no one shouted the answer. Inside the command spaces, screens glowed with ruthless clarity. Radar sweeps stitched the sky into a living map. Infrared tracked heat signatures down to the smallest fluctuation. Algorithms predicted trajectories faster than human thought. Every maneuver was measured, projected, countered before it finished happening. This wasn't chaos. It was controlled exposure. The jets came closer. Too close. One passed shaved distance down to hundreds of feet. Another cut beneath the Hornet's nose, triggering proximity alarms that screamed urgency into the cockpit. The American pilot didn't flinch. Hands steady, breathing measured, cameras rolling, data flowing, because reaction is a trap. Down below, defenses layer themselves silently. Destroyers tighten their arcs. Electronic warfare systems whispered into the spectrum, muddying targeting just enough to introduce doubt. Not a blackout, a suggestion, a decoy made of uncertainty. The kind that forces a pilot to think twice. That hesitation mattered. On the bridge, the order never changed. Maintain heading. Maintain speed. 20 knots. North-northwest. The ship didn't lean away from danger. It leaned into doctrine. Here's the paradox of restraint. It looks passive until you realize how much control it takes not to act. Another jet dove. Lower this time. Shadows raced across the water as metal screamed overhead. Shockwaves slapped the sea. For a moment, it felt like the world narrowed to a single breath. One wrong input, one delayed correction, and the morning would rupture into fire and debris. 10 seconds. 8. 6. What would you do if you knew pressing the trigger would be easier than holding your line? The carriers closed and defenses tracked automatically. Barrels slewed. Sensors locked. The system was ready to end the argument in a fraction of a second. All it needed was permission. Permission never came. That was the turning point. Because power isn't proven when you fire. It's proven when you don't need to. The Hornet slid back into shadow position, refusing the bait. No radar locks. No aggressive climbs. Just presence. Persistent. Unavoidable. Recording everything. The Venezuelan jets were no longer performers on a stage. They were subjects under observation. Every dive, every turn, every radio emission logged and archived. This is how gray zone conflict works. No declarations, no explosions, just pressure applied below the threshold of war, hoping someone panics and hand you legitimacy. Hoping emotion beats discipline. It didn't. The Venezuelan pilots felt it. You could see it in the spacing, in the hesitation before the next maneuver, in the widening arcs that replace sharp cuts. Intimidation relies on escalation. When escalation fails, it collapses into exposure. One jet painted the formation with targeting radar. Brief, deliberate, a line crossed and immediately uncrossed. The response was silence. No flares, no evasive turn, just data captured and time noted. Silence weaponized. This is a deeper lesson. Strategy beats force when force has no strategy behind it. Mind over mass. Foresight over firepower. The most dangerous systems aren't missiles or guns. They're doctrines that deny your opponent the reaction they need to win. Eventually, the jets pulled away. Not triumphantly, not cleanly. They drifted back toward the horizon like a gamble that didn't pay out. The sky widened again. The sea resumed its calm, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened, because every second of that encounter now lived forever, on servers and briefings, in calculations that would shape the next move. The confrontation hadn't ended. It had been stored. And that's the real dominance. Turning provocation into evidence. Turning risk into leverage. As the carrier group pressed on, unchanged in course or speed, one truth settled in. The most volatile moments aren't when weapons fire. They're when discipline holds under unbearable pressure. And somewhere far from the Caribbean sun, someone was reviewing the footage, learning exactly how close they could get next time. Because the line hadn't disappeared. It had simply been mapped. At 6:37, the sky emptied as suddenly as it filled. No explosion, no victory roll, just fading engine noise and silence that felt heavier than the confrontation itself. The Venezuelan jets peeled away one by one, slipping back toward the mainland, their silhouettes shrinking against the glare of the morning sun. The sea returned to glass. The carrier kept its course. 20 knots, north-northwest. No celebration, no relief, only the quiet continuation of motion, because restraint doesn't announce itself. In the minutes that followed, nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. No alarms, no posture change. Sensors stayed awake. Cameras kept recording. The strike group moved forward as if the last half hour had been routine, as if the sky hadn't just flirted with catastrophe. But elsewhere, the story was already being rewritten. By midday, Venezuelan state television aired grainy footage of the flybys. Bold captions, triumphant language, claims that the American carrier had been forced to retreat, that sovereignty had been defended. That pressure had worked. It was a familiar tactic. When you can't control reality, control the narrative. Across the ocean, the response was colder. No dramatic press conference. No chest-thumping statements. Just a measured line from U.S. officials. Unsafe, unprofessional, dangerous. Words chosen carefully. Because the real audience wasn't the public. It was every military planner watching closely. Here's the contrast no headline can fully capture. One side needed spectacle. The other needed consistency. One needed a moment. The other needed the line to hold. And it did. Inside secure rooms far from the Caribbean, footage played on loop. Every near miss, every radar spike, every aggressive dive broken down frame by frame. Not to inflame, but to understand. This wasn't about blame. It was about learning the algorithm behind intimidation. Because modern power projection isn't about how loud you are. It's about how predictable you are under stress. The carrier didn't blink. That mattered more than any statement. In an era where conflicts rarely start with declarations, where gray zones blur peace and war, composure becomes a weapon. Judgment becomes deterrence. Silence becomes signal. Think about the asymmetry. Fighter jets darting for seconds versus a floating city that never altered its path. Millions versus billions. Speed versus mass. Emotion versus doctrine. And yet, the balance tipped not because of force, but because of control. That's the paradigm shift most people miss. The most advanced weapons aboard that carrier never fired. The electromagnetic catapults. The radar arrays. The layered defenses, all of it existed in a state of readiness, not use. Potential energy held in check. That restraint sent a clearer message than any missile launch ever could. Because anyone can escalate. Not everyone can hold the line. Out on deck, sailors returned to routine. Aircraft were serviced. Watch rotations continued. Coffee cups refilled. The sea stayed calm. To an outsider, it looked uneventful. To those who understood, it was a masterclass in discipline under pressure. This is what real strength looks like when the cameras aren't flattering. Not aggression, not bravado, but the ability to absorb pressure without deforming, to remain algorithmically steady while chaos tries to provoke a rupture. The Venezuelan jets had wanted a reaction. They got documentation. They wanted movement. They got stillness. They wanted a moment. They got a record. And records last longer than propaganda. Yet, the lesson cuts deeper than one encounter. This wasn't about Venezuela, or one carrier, or one morning in the Caribbean. It was about the future of confrontation itself, where the battlefield is perception, where the first casualty is judgment, where the winner is often the one who denies the other a mistake. Strategy over force, mind over mass, foresight over firepower. The carrier sailed on, unchanged, but the implications rippled outward. Every nation watching took notes. Every pilot recalculated. Every commander asked the same quiet question. If pressure fails to move them, what will? Because next time, the test might not come with warning passes and visible jets. It might come quieter, faster, closer to the line that matters most. And when that moment arrives, when the countdown isn't measured in seconds but in consequences, the real question won't be who has the biggest weapons. It will be who has the discipline to not use them.